The chapel was small. That was the first thing I noticed when I walked in. Small, old, the kind of building that had been standing longer than anyone inside it had been alive. Wood floors that creaked if you stepped wrong. Windows with that thick, wavy glass that makes the light look like it's moving, even when everything outside is perfectly still. I chose the last row on purpose. I told myself I was being respectful, staying out of the way, not making my presence into something it wasn't supposed to be. But if I'm being honest with myself, and that's kind of the whole point of me telling you this story, I sat in the back because I needed to be close to the door. I needed to know I could leave the second any part of this felt like a mistake. I had driven 4 hours to get there. 4 hours of Georgia highway, gas station coffee, and a playlist I had to keep changing because every third song reminded me of something I was trying not to think about. I passed towns I recognized and towns I didn't. I watched the skyline go from Atlanta glass and concrete to pine trees and red dirt roads, and the whole time some part of me kept asking the same quiet question. Why are you doing this, Celeste? I didn't have a clean answer. I still don't fully. But I got out of that car. I smoothed down my dress, a simple navy blue dress, nothing that said I was trying to be noticed, and I walked into that chapel and I sat in the very last row, near the door, where no one would see me unless they were looking. The pews filled up slowly. His people, his family, his world. A world I had spent 1.5 years existing just outside of, close enough to feel its warmth but never quite let through the door. The music started, something classical on an old upright piano, the kind of music that makes a room feel like it's holding its breath. The bride walked down the aisle, and she was beautiful. Genuinely. I want to be clear about that because it matters to the kind of person I am and to the kind of story this actually is, that I saw her and I felt nothing bitter. She was tall, graceful, with flowers woven into her hair and a dress that looked like it had been made specifically for her body. She looked like a woman who had never once doubted she deserved to be exactly where she was standing. I respected that. And then the groom came to the altar, and Pastor Hines began to speak. And for a moment, just one moment, everything was exactly what it was supposed to be. And then he turned. I don't know why he turned. Maybe he sensed something. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe some part of him had been waiting for the same thing I had, without either of us saying it out loud. But he turned toward the back of the chapel, and his eyes moved across the rows, and then they landed on me. And the smile left his face. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that anyone else probably noticed. It wasn't anger. It wasn't surprise exactly. It was more like recognition. The look of someone who has been performing a version of themselves for a long time and then sees something that reminds them of who they actually are. That look lasted maybe 4 seconds. Then he turned back to the altar and the ceremony continued, and I sat in that last row with my hands folded in my lap and I breathed, slow and steady, the way Aunt Gloria taught me to breathe when things get heavy. And I thought, I should tell you how we got here. I was 26 years old when I met Weston Cole. I was working a contract job for the Savannah Preservation Society, which sounds more prestigious than it was. Basically, they hired me to document plants, rare ones, old ones, the kind of botanical specimens that don't show up in any modern garden catalog because most people stopped paying attention to them 100 years ago. My job was to draw them, by hand, detailed scientific illustrations that could be used in preservation records and grant applications and educational materials. It was quiet work. I liked quiet work. The garden I was assigned to was on the grounds of an old estate that the Preservation Society had recently acquired. Beautiful property. old magnolias, a koi pond that had gone half wild, stone pathways that were slowly being swallowed by moss. And in the far northeastern corner, growing up along a crumbling wall, was the reason I was really there. A Schwalbia americana, American chaff seed, a flowering vine so rare it had been taken off the federal endangered list only recently, meaning someone, somewhere, had finally found enough surviving plants to believe the species might make it. This wall had several. I had been working there for about 3 weeks when the architect showed up. Weston, Cole, 31 years old, tall, sandy-haired, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from growing up in a house where nobody ever told you that you were taking up too much space. He worked for a firm out of Charleston that specialized in historic restoration. He had been hired to design a new structural support system for the estate's outbuildings, which on paper had nothing to do with me, except that his structural plan required removing a 12-foot section of the northeastern wall, my wall. I found out when I came in one morning and found him standing there with a clipboard, marking measurements, completely unbothered. I introduced myself. I explained what was growing on that wall. I explained what losing that wall would mean for those plants. He listened politely, nodded, and told me the structural assessment had been approved and the timeline was already set. I told him the timeline was going to need to change. He looked at me for a second, like he wasn't used to someone pushing back that quickly, and then something shifted in his expression. Not annoyance, more like interest, like I had suddenly become a more complicated problem than he expected, and he found that genuinely engaging. "Let me see what you're working with," he said. I showed him. I walked him along that wall, and I explained every plant, every vine, every reason that corner of the garden mattered. He asked questions, real questions, not polite ones. He crouched down and looked at the root system where the vine met the stone. He was quiet for a long time. "All right," he said finally. "I'll redesign around it." Just like that. His colleagues were not thrilled. It added 2 weeks and a fair amount of money to the project, but he held his position and the wall stayed, and somewhere in those 2 weeks of revised blueprints and site meetings and long conversations that started about load-bearing structures and ended up about everything else, something started between us. I didn't name it right away. I'm careful with names. Words make things real, and I wanted to be sure before I made it real. But I'll tell you this, he looked at me like I was the most interesting room he had ever walked into. And I, fool that I was, let him in. 6 months. That's how long we had what I can only describe as the in-between, not a relationship with a name, not a casual thing either. Something in the space between those two words where neither of us pushed to define it because defining it would have required honesty we weren't quite ready for yet. We took long drives on Sunday afternoons. We cooked together in my apartment, badly mostly because neither of us was particularly gifted in the kitchen, but we were good at laughing at ourselves. He would bring his drafting sketchbook sometimes and draw while I illustrated, both of us quiet in the same room in a way that felt comfortable rather than empty. He told me about his father, a man who had very specific ideas about what a coal was supposed to be and who a coal was supposed to be with. He said it lightly, the way people do when something is heavy, but they haven't decided to put it down yet. I heard what he wasn't saying. I heard it, and I filed it away, and I told myself it didn't matter because what was happening between us was real, and real things have a way of making old fears irrelevant. I was wrong about that. The cracks showed up quietly, the way they always do, not in one big moment, but in 100 small ones. The time his mother called and he stepped outside onto the porch to take it, pulling the door almost all the way closed behind him, and I sat at his kitchen table and listened to the muffled sound of his voice going careful and neutral in a way it never did when he talked to me. The work dinner where a colleague looked at us and said, "Well, this is unexpected," with a smile that was friendly on the surface and something else entirely underneath, and Weston laughed and moved the conversation along, and later, when I brought it up in the car, he said, "People are just surprised. It doesn't mean anything." It meant something. I knew it meant something. He knew it too, I think. But we were both invested enough by then that neither of us wanted to be the one to say it first. The night it finally broke open, we were sitting on the porch of Aunt Gloria's house. She had gone to bed. It was warm, late summer, the kind of Georgia night that smells like honeysuckle and approaching rain. And I just asked him, "What are we doing, Weston?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he said all the right things, that I mattered to him, that what we had was real, that he just needed time to figure out how to handle his family and his life and the expectations that had been built around him since before he was old enough to have his own. He said the right things. And then the weeks passed and nothing changed. No introduction to his family, no acknowledgement in the spaces where it counted. Just the same warmth in private and the same careful distance in public. I stopped calling as much. Then I stopped calling at all. He let me. And that was the answer I had been asking for without using those exact words. Loving someone in secret is its own kind of violence. It's slow and it's quiet, and the worst part is that you do most of it to yourself. You shrink. You make excuses. You decide that half of something real is better than all of something ordinary. And by the time you finally stop, you have spent so long being small that you have to actively remember how to take up space again. I left Savannah 3 months later. I didn't make it dramatic. I finished my contract, packed my apartment, hugged Aunt Gloria, and drove to Atlanta. I gave myself permission to cry exactly once on that drive, for about 20 minutes somewhere around mile marker 114 on I-16. Then I turned the music up and I didn't look back. Atlanta was good to me. I found a studio apartment with good northern light, which matters enormously when your work is about color and detail. I picked up bigger contracts, a natural history museum commission, a series of prints for a university's biology department, a children's book about native Georgia plants that I'm still proud of. My work got better, quieter, and more confident at the same time, which I think is what growth actually looks like when you're not performing it for anyone. Aunt Gloria called every Sunday without fail. Dre, my best friend since we were both 7 years old running around the same neighborhood in Macon, came to visit twice and made fun of my furniture both times. Life moved the way life does. I dated a little. A man named Curtis who was kind and funny and worked in hospital administration and was absolutely wrong for me in a way that had nothing to do with either of us being bad people. We figured that out after 4 months and parted on genuinely good terms. There was someone else briefly. I won't even dignify it with detail. The point is, I was living, actually living, not just recovering. There's a difference, and it took me a while to feel it clearly. Then one Thursday afternoon in October, Dre called me. I was in the middle of inking a series of seed pod illustrations, which requires a level of concentration that makes me slightly annoyed when the phone rings. I almost let it go to voicemail, but it was Dre, and Dre doesn't call on weekdays unless something has happened. "You hear about Weston Cole?" she said the second I picked up. Something shifted in my chest, just slightly, like a drawer that sticks being opened too fast. "No," I said. "What about him?" "He's getting married," she said. "Spring wedding. Some woman from Charleston, I think. Her family's in tobacco farming or something. Big event, apparently." I was quiet for a second. "Good for him," I said. And I meant it, mostly. Let's say 40%. I meant 40% of it in that exact moment, and the rest of it I had to talk myself into over the following hour. I finished my seed pods. I made tea. I stood at my kitchen window and watched the Atlanta evening settle in over the rooftops, and I let myself feel whatever needed to be felt without giving it a name or a story. Just the feeling, plain and human and passing. Then I made more tea and went to bed. What I couldn't shake, not that night, not in the weeks that followed, wasn't the news itself. It was one specific thought that kept surfacing no matter how many times I pushed it back down. I never knew if any of it had been real. Not for him. I knew what it had been for me. But him, his warmth, his attention, the way he talked to me like I was worth understanding, I never knew if that was the real Weston Cole or the version of himself he could only afford to be in private. That question sat in me like a stone. 3 weeks before his wedding, a letter arrived at my Atlanta address. Not an email, a letter, handwritten on thick cream paper in the careful architectural print I recognized immediately even before I turned the envelope over and saw his name. 4 pages. I stood at my kitchen counter and read all 4 pages without moving. Then I sat down and read them again. He wasn't asking me to stop the wedding. He wasn't declaring that he had made a terrible mistake or that he still loved me or any of the dramatic things a letter like that could have been. It was quieter than that, more honest than anything he had managed to say when we were actually standing in the same room. He wrote about the night on Aunt Gloria's porch. He said he had known, sitting there, that he was failing me, that his silence afterward wasn't indifference, it was fear. Fear of his father's voice in his head, fear of the shape his life had been poured into before he was old enough to question it, fear of being the kind of man who chooses comfort over courage. He said he was marrying someone good. He said he hoped he would become someone worthy of her. And then, near the end, he wrote, "I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I have spent 2 years not saying the true thing, and I'm trying to be done with that. What we were to each other was real. You deserved better than what I gave you. I know that." He did not ask me to come to the wedding. He did not ask me to stay away. He just told the truth, finally. Too late and in a letter rather than a conversation, but true. I showed it to Aunt Gloria when I drove home that weekend. She read the whole thing at her kitchen table with her reading glasses on, her coffee going cold beside her. When she finished, she folded it back up precisely and set it down and looked at me. "Baby," she said, "that man handed you the end of a story. The question is whether you want to read the last page in person or just let the book close." I sat with that for 3 weeks. And then I put on a navy blue dress and I drove 4 hours and I sat in the last row of a small chapel in the Georgia countryside. Not to take anything, not to break anything, not even to be seen necessarily, though I was. Just to be present for the ending of something that had never been allowed a proper ending. Just to close the door myself, from the inside, with my own hand. He said his vows in a steady voice. I watched him. I watched his hands, his shoulders, the line of his jaw. I watched him be present for the woman standing across from him in a way he had never quite managed to be fully present for me. And I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Relief. Not the bitter kind, the real kind. The kind that comes when something you've been carrying for a long time finally settles into its right shape and you understand clearly that it was never going to be yours and that was not a failure of your worth, it was just the truth. Pastor Hines said the words that have been said in chapels like this one for hundreds of years. The light came through those old wavy windows and moved the way light does in places that have held a lot of human feeling over a long time. When the pastor said, "You may kiss the bride," I stood up, quietly, slowly, the way you stand when you have already made your peace and you are simply following through on a decision. I walked out of that chapel without looking back. Outside, the Georgia sun was warm and direct and completely indifferent to the personal significance of what had just happened inside that building, which I found oddly comforting. I stood in the parking lot for a moment and just breathed, slow and steady, Aunt Gloria's way. And I felt light. Actually, genuinely light. Like something that had been resting on my shoulders for 2 years had simply decided it was done now and lifted away. I got in my car. I pulled out of that gravel lot. I drove back toward Atlanta with the windows down and no playlist, just the sound of the road and the warm air and the particular silence of a thing being finished. I didn't go there to take anything from anyone. I went there to give something back to myself. And I did. 2 months later, he called. I was in my studio, working on a new commission, a series of illustrations for a botanical journal, native wetland plants, the kind of quiet, detailed work that requires your full attention and rewards it. His name came up on my screen. I looked at it. I let it ring. I watched it go to voicemail. I did not listen to the voicemail. Not that day, not the next day. Eventually, I deleted it without listening. And I want to be honest, that decision cost me something. Some part of me wanted to know. Some small, human, stubborn part of me was still curious about what his voice would sound like saying whatever he needed to say. But I had already gotten what I went to that chapel for, and whatever was in that voicemail was for him, not for me. It was him working something out that he needed to work out, and that was fine, but it wasn't my work to receive anymore. I called Dre that evening. He called, I said. And I didn't answer. She was quiet for a second. Then, "You good?" I thought about it honestly before I answered. I looked around my studio, the drawings pinned to the wall, the good northern light going gold in the late afternoon, the cup of tea on my work table, the life I had built in this city that was genuinely, completely mine. "Yeah," I said. "I think I actually am." Here's what I know now that I didn't know when I was 26, sitting in a garden arguing about a wall. Healing doesn't always look like moving on. Sometimes it looks like going back. Sometimes you have to return to the place a thing broke in order to find the piece of yourself you left there. Not to reopen it, not to fix it or change it, just to retrieve what's yours and walk away clean. That letter he sent, I don't hold it against him, and I don't treasure it either. It lives in a drawer somewhere. It was honest and it was late, and both of those things can be true at the same time. What I hold on to is something smaller. That spring, the Savannah Preservation Society sent me a photograph in the mail. Just a printed photo tucked inside a plain card. The northeastern wall of the old estate, still standing, and climbing up along it in full white and yellow bloom for the first time in 11 years were the Swalbia americana vines. Alive, thriving, completely unbothered. I had it framed, hung it above my work desk, where I see it every single day. Some things survive because somebody refused to let them be erased. When I sat in that last row, I wasn't the woman who had loved a man who wasn't brave enough to love her back in public. I was a woman who had protected something rare and then had the sense to walk away before the protection became a prison. I think about that version of myself, 26, standing in a garden, absolutely certain that a wall was worth fighting for, and I feel nothing but affection for her. She was right. She was right about the wall. She was right about herself. She just needed a little more time to know it fully. Some things survive because somebody refused to let them be erased. I think I'm one of them.